Hi, everyone. I'm Tutti, and I'm an engineer at Mercari and director of Women Who Code Tokyo. So really glad to be here today. And today I'll be talking about scaling software development teams and Codebase. So how to go from a small project with just a few people to a large system and big teams. So let's go into it. Okay, so first let me introduce myself. Like I said, I'm Tutti, and you can find me online at TuttiQ. And I'm originally from Brazil, but now I'm working in Tokyo. And I'm a computer engineering major. I majored back in Brazil, and I'm a software engineer since 2011, mostly working with full stack web development. And, well, I'm already here. You're seeing my face, so I figure I would just put my dog there. Isn't she cute? And like I said, I'm a director at Women Who Code Tokyo, and this is how we recruit volunteers. No, just kidding. But, of course, some of our volunteer meetings are powered by pizza, because you have to feed hungry leaders, right? But yeah, we have like a lot of events in Tokyo and an amazing team of volunteers. Some other of them are here in this event. And currently, I'm working for Mercari. If you haven't heard of Mercari, it is a user-to-user selling app. So it is very, very popular in Japan. People like buy and sell secondhand stuff, and now expanding to the US recently. So you might have seen some ads or not. And Mercari is a big sponsor of Women Who Code Tokyo. They really help us hosting all the events there and with a lot of support. And we are also official sponsors of this conference. So we do have expo table at the entrance. You can check out the booth, get some swags, and get to know more about our company, especially if you're interested in working in Palo Alto, Boston, or Tokyo. Yeah. So a little bit about my trajectory, so you understand the background, the context behind what I'm going to be talking about today. So as I said, I'm originally from Brazil. I worked there as a software engineer for a while, and then I moved to London, and I was working as a full stack engineer there as well for 2 years. And finally, I moved to Tokyo a year and a half ago, been working there. And I worked in very small startups from like 15 people up to like multinational companies like Bosch and Samsung. So I've been in a very different kind of environments throughout my career. And the teams that I worked for were as small as like 3 people or as large as like 13 people working on the same project. And we built things from like simple web pages to complex multi-app platforms. So I've seen all kind of development processes around that, and softwares for like many different amount of users as well. And let me start this with a disclaimer. So this presentation will touch controversial topics like team structures or development process or code readability, that is very controversial, or design patterns or best practices. Who knows what's best practices, right? So just so you know, a lot of the content is opinion-based and subjective to exceptions or counter-arguments. Take it with a grain of salt, and feel free to disagree, and let's have a discussion on that later on. And before I go further, if you want to get those slides, you can scan this QR code now and have the slides on your phone or access them later on. They're on speaker deck as well. You can just look for Tutti, Quintella, and you're going to find the slides there if you want to go into the details and criticize every single bit. Just leave it there for a few seconds if anyone else wants to scan. Okay. Okay, so the basics of software development process. So very superficially simplified version. You write some code, you commit your changes, and you push to your repo, hopefully. And then you deploy to your servers, and then your app is live. As simple as that. Very, very simplified version. But let's add some complexity into this project. So, for example, you start having like more and more files within your projects, and let's say, like here, things are already starting to get a little bit confusing. Like there's menu and menu 2. What are the difference between them? Well, I don't know because I didn't name them properly. So that's what starts happening. And let's suppose I'm going to start working on a new feature on my system that is a search feature. So I create this file here, search.js. I'm going to start writing some code for search. But I didn't know that my coworker, Maria, also started working on a different search feature. And she decided to create a file named item search. So now which one is which? And my search logic is distributed in 2 different places, and I don't know where to find stuff. And this is just a very small example. But when your team starts to grow and your project starts to grow, then the problem scales as well. So what you have is like a lot of people working on a very confusing code base and adding a lot of problems if you don't have rules and guidelines. So you start adding redundancy, you start adding bugs, conflicts, inconsistency. And yes, my whole team is the cast of Friends. Yeah. And me, I'm here, I don't even know where to start because it's so damn confusing and I cannot find anything. So what happens is you end up with the snowball effect. So problem over problem starts piling, and you have unstable system. You have the complexity that keeps increasing over time. And your team is under like high stress and low productivity because everyone is trying to like figure things out on a really messy code base. And your technical debt is building up. You don't have time to fix it because your productivity is already low. And you take a really long time to ramp up new developers on your team. How are you going to explain the code base to them? So how do we scale efficiently? So there are mainly 4 topics that I'm going to go over on this talk. And we start off with reducing the knowledge sharing bottleneck. So the less you have to explain to other people, the better. And that can be helped by organized and intuitive code base, and documentation, of course, helps a lot. And then I'm going to go over the other topics as well. So let's start here. So when you're scaling the code base, a few things that help making your code base easy to understand are having a decent system design, having a coding style guide, and following best practices. And what does that mean? Let's go over system design. So when you talk about system design, the first thing that comes to mind is design patterns. So design patterns are made to help you, to give you a guideline on how to split your code into smaller parts and componentize your app. And this helps because each part will have a more defined responsibility in a smaller scope. And of course, one of the benefits of using design patterns is that if you use a well-known design pattern, a lot of developers are already familiar with them, so you really don't have to teach. Or if they're not familiar, you have a bunch of learning resources that you can find easily. So that makes the process a lot easier. So who here have heard of MVC? Okay, a lot of people. Who have used and know how to use MVC? Okay, cool, good amount. So yeah, MVC is a very popular design pattern that consists in dividing your code into models, views, and controllers. So for the ones that are not familiar with it, like the model layer is the one that is going to interact with your database. It's basically going to map your data, or they can be like your business logic objects. Then the views is exactly what the name says, is the UI part of your app or the interaction part, the presentation layer of your app. And the controllers will help making the connection between those two getting some requests from the view and triggering some behaviors on the models, like saving or fetching data, or redirecting you to other views. So this is a very popular design pattern. But sometimes only M, V, and C is not enough, because your code does get bigger and bigger, and you end up with very fat controllers that we say. There's very long files, very fat models, and too much logic in one place. So this is just like a small example of a controller that has a lot of logic here. For example, login and authentication logic, some error handling, and some parsing of params. And this is only like 2 actions in a controller that usually have a lot more actions than that. So you can imagine how big this file is going to get. And what are the problems of having like fat components? The problem is that like it's really hard to find logic, especially looking at the file structure. Because if you have a lot of logic inside one file, you cannot figure that out by the file name or by our tree structure. It's harder to read and understand what a component does. Again, like everything is in the same place, so you have to really like find stuff there is really harder. And the component starts getting too specific and less reusable. And it's really hard to break your app into separate modules because all the logic is coupled in the same place. And it makes it harder to unit test as well. So the first advice when you, especially when you're talking about MVC, is like keep your controllers skinny and make your models fat. So that means your controller should only concern the routing logic, only getting the request, sending to the model, getting the data, sending to the view. So your controller should be very small scope, very defined. But then what happens is that when you're talking about like, okay, just shove all the logic in the models, your models don't only get fat, they get obese. So like real life example, like a user class with more than 700 lines, because you have like all the operations regarding users there. And the second advice that comes when you talk about like reducing the size of your files is mixins. So just like pull a bunch of logic out of component and put into a module or an interface, and then you include or implement that later on. But is that really organizing your code? Or you're just like getting a really huge messy file and dividing it into 5 smaller messy files? The analogy is like getting a messy room and then shoving everything into drawers. So on the outside, it looks tidy and clean, but then when you open the drawers, you cannot find anything because it's still pretty messy. So careful with mixins. So what are actually good ways of extracting logic from your files? So mixins properly implemented, when you actually extract a behavior that is going to be reused in other classes, and it's generic enough to be reusable. Or extracting things like value objects. For example, every value that you have in your app that you can map to an object that is not like a primitive type. For example, a color, an address, a phone number, you can extract to its own class. Or service objects. For example, you extract a logic regarding a whole operation or a whole behavior that is reusable and take it out of the class. For example, creating a user authenticator and removing all the authentication logic out of the user model. And there are other ways, policy objects, form objects, query objects. The list goes on and on. If you want to know more about that, I actually have a talk on that. It's called Refactoring Fat Components. And you can scan now to get the slides for that talk. Or if you have the slides for this one, you can click the link. It's also on my speaker deck. And well, if you keep like breaking your things down and modularizing, you see where I'm going with this. The next step would be to actually break your application into smaller services. So what you do is like you're extracting those components into their own things and you encapsulate them into services, and then you make those services connect to each other, and you can even distribute a system into different servers or however you prefer. And that's when we talk about microservices. But of course, easier said than done. There's a lot of challenges and approaches to implementing microservices architecture, and this could be a whole other talk only on that topic. But that's the whole idea. I'm just going to move on now. So back to maintaining your code base, the next would be having a coding style guide. So why should I have a coding style guide? Because if your code is completely inconsistent, if you don't follow any rules, you start adding a lot of inefficiency. So every time that your developers are coding, they're going to be asking like, oh, am I supposed to use camel case or a snake case? Or is this, if you don't have any standards for constants or variables, you never know what a variable is, if it is a constant or not. And if you don't have consistency on your indentation, you never know if something is part of a block or if it's just like misaligned or something like that. So the coding style guide will help getting those things like right away. You get used to it. And for example, there are a lot of like famous coding style guides that you can just adopt. You don't have to write your own. So for example, the Google HTML and CSS style guide will say you should ident by 2 spaces at a time. Or, for example, the Ruby style guide will say you should avoid single line methods and just make it like this with like one line inside. And so like you can adopt any of those coding style guides you can find online. There are several options and you see what works best for you. And best practices. So there are several known best practices that developers usually try to follow to make the code base scalable. And one of my favorites, the single responsibility principle. So just like we were talking before, breaking your components so a class, a method, or a component should have only one responsibility. You don't want your classes to end up like this. Other one is dry. Don't repeat yourself. So if you're copying and pasting a lot of code with little alteration, it probably means it could be a reusable function or a module or a plugin. So just make it generic, extract, and reuse instead of copying and pasting. And there are many others. One that I really like is the Boy Scout rule. So leave the campground cleaner than you found it. So every time that you're coding, if you see something that doesn't comply with a best practice or the style guide or something, just like go and fix it. Obviously, don't start a full refactor for every change that you're going to do, or you're never going to finish your changes. But just a little bit of adjustment, it's good to leave the campground cleaner. And next up is documentation to help the knowledge sharing. So the basic style of documentation, obviously, is code annotation or making comments on your code. So like this, if you have a method that does something, you add a comment on top saying what it's doing. And some people would say, well, your code should be your documentation. It should be so easy to understand that you don't need to make a comment. That's fair, and like it should be the case most of the time. But a lot of times, the simplest that you can write is still a little bit confusing. Sometimes there's a business logic that is hard to understand. Some like operations or like that it's just like not so easy to grasp. So it's okay for you to go and leave a comment like saying what this business logic is doing. And you can add some comments in your code like that. And that helps when other people are going to maintain this code. They can like grasp right away, oh, this is what this line is doing. Let you know, give you like warnings or alerts if you have a sudden raise in a specific exception, or if your queries on your database are taking too long. So you can figure out that you just shipped a problematic piece of code and revert it right away. This gives you confidence to ship faster. And as obvious as it may sound to software engineers, automation of repetitive tasks. Of course, if you're trying to make your development process more efficient. So again, there are tools to help with that, like Circle CI or Jenkins. I love the angry Jenkins. Isn't that lovely? They have like a whole page of artwork of variations of Jenkins logo. It's great. And Circle CI, those tools can automate your workflows. So for example, you can set up them to every time you push changes to your repo, it will run all your tests and do not let you merge a PR that the tests are failing. So with this, you already you don't have to worry about running your tests all the time or like accidentally merging breaking changes. Or other things that you can do is automatically deploy to your servers once a PR is merged into like your production branch or your development branch, and you have it like deployed and running right away. And automating your part of your code reviews. So remember when I was talking about coding style guide, how boring and annoying it would be if you had to pay attention every time, like, oh, I didn't indent 2 spaces. I used 3 by mistake. Or like, I just did like a single line method that the Ruby style guide doesn't like. So imagine if you had to remember all of that, or if your coworkers had to spend a lot of time reviewing your code and pointing out each one of those. Oh, you should add a line here. You should add a space here. That would be really annoying. So luckily, there are tools that will do that for you, like linters or safety checkers. So this one here is an example of Rubocop. This is the Ruby linter. And you can configure like the rules that you want to follow in your team. And you can make like a configuration file with which violations are critical that you really want to fix, or which ones are okay, we'll just like raise a warning. And even further, it can auto-fix for you if you set up like that. So you can even set up in your code editor to auto-fix every time you save a file. Done. You don't have to worry about it anymore. And at last, but really, really important, let's talk about structured teams and processes. So what is the problem when your team starts growing and everyone is touching the same code base? So a lot of people are discussing the same domain of problems and getting into conflicting decisions. And everyone is working across all technologies and business logic that implies a lot of context that they have to hold in one person's brain, which is a lot. And you have the lack of boundaries and roles, which ends up getting you into a big mess. Everyone is touching the same thing. So in my experience, what have I learned? That teams with more than 5 to 6 people tend to organically split into smaller groups. Why is that? Because people, a lot of the times, they're insecure about sharing things with everyone. So if you have like a round with like 10 people, a lot of people would just stay quiet and not say anything. Or like they would just like make friends with 2 people from the team and just talk to them, just ask them to review their code all the time. So they organically split. And you end up with too much context from too many sides, which is hard to absorb. If you have like opinions from 10 different people, you cannot remember like, oh, how did we get to this conclusion anyways? So smaller teams are better. And meetings with more than 5 to 6 people tend to have a maximum of 2 to 3 active participants. Again, people are insecure about speaking in front of everyone, so they'll just stay quiet. And it's hard to find a break to jump into the conversation if you have a lot of people talking. Every time you try to say something, someone else already started, and it's like, okay, never mind. I'll just not say anything. And it takes longer to reach any conclusion because people keep bringing like opinion and repeating themselves and bringing redundancy of opinions, and you never reach anything. So keep your meetings to less people. And of course, defining roles and rules will help things to just move on their own. So for example, if you have processes and standards that everyone follows, like workflow for PRs, for opening tickets, or for writing docs, or even if you have templates. So can you imagine every time you submit a PR on your code, someone has to come and say like, oh, can you add a screenshot to that? Oh, can you add a description a little bit better? Can you, I don't know, add the API response that you changed? So like every time you have this back and forth of asking to make your PR more descriptive or easier to understand, if you have a template that everyone has to fill when they submit the PR, end of the problem. Yeah, a defined project or a sprint cycle as well, where you define all the tasks that you're going to do. So this can be easily related to like project management methodologies like Agile, Waterfall, whatever you want to follow. Just have it defined and have your team be on the same page. And define roles and tasks that everyone should do. So have this defined on your team as well. Like, when is the time to do code cleanup? Do you do code cleanup during the project, during the ticket that you're working on? Or do you have a refactor time after your sprint? Define that with your team. Who does code review? Do you assign reviewers? Do you just wait for someone to get it? Like sometimes your PR can end up in the limbo of no one is reviewing it. So have a process for that. If your releases are not like automated, define how the release process is going to work. If you have a rotation of people working on it, or if you have a team that is responsible for it, that kind of thing. And task assignment and strategy. Is it self-assigned or is manager assigned? Just define it so you don't have tasks that will also fall in the limbo of no one is ever getting them. And the ways of structuring your teams that I've worked with mostly are per project or per business domain. So per project, you're going to have a team that comes together for one project. They do the project, and then the team splits up, and the next term you have another project with a different team. Or a team for a business domain. That's going to be always the same team to work on the same part of the code. And that approach goes very well with microservices, like I mentioned before. So if you split your system into smaller independent microservices, you can have one team for each microservice, and they will have a defined scope. They will become specialized. So that works really well over time. And information sharing, make it easier and easy to find information for your team. So there are many tools that can help you with that. One of the most popular ones are Jira or Confluence. There's Trello, there's Wiki, and this is Notion that we use at Women Who Code Tokyo. So we organize all of our resources and documents as a wiki, and then we have our task management board where we can see the progress of each task and what everyone is doing. So those kind of tools really help to keep things moving forward and help you don't have to worry so much about communicating everything all the time. And last but not least, just like a team is always made of people, made of human beings. So remember that. And encourage knowledge sharing on your team. Encourage people to make presentations, to share what they know, to mentor new developers or junior developers that join your team. Encourage the teamwork feeling. A lot of people will say that team building is just like, having fun is not really work, but it's really, really important to have your team really like feel good together and be inspired and have goals. So that everything will move faster, and you're going to realize it's going to be a lot more efficient. And do encourage transparent communication. So it reduces a lot of the overhead. And that's it. We went through all this checklist for now for making your development more efficient. So if you have any questions, please ask. And if you want to come and ask questions after it, like I said, I'm working in Tokyo, so I brought some souvenirs from Tokyo. So come along, talk to me after the talk and get some. And please get in contact anytime. Thank you.
So if you have questions, I'll be coming around with the microphone. I know the next round of talks starts at 11:45. So if you need to be in a different meeting, in a different building for your next talk or something, now is a good time to get going for that. But yeah, let's start with questions.
I was just going to ask if you could put the QR scan code up again.
Which one? This slide? The first one? Yeah. Sure.
That was it.
Oh, here.
Questions?
Oh, we're done.
How do you like working in Tokyo?
Good question. So it's actually a lot better than I thought. There is I don't know, I think like a misconception that the Japanese work style can be hard for some people to adapt, but that's not my experience at all. So I worked for 2 companies in Japan, and they both were like great culture. Like at Mercari as well, we don't have to do like a lot of overtime, and the culture inside the company is pretty much friendly. We have a diversity and inclusion team as well, with a lot of initiatives that are supporting women to get to leadership roles. And Tokyo is an amazing city. I really recommend it. Like it's like a huge metropolis that is clean. That you think like it's impossible to be clean like that, but it is. And Japanese people are really, really polite and nice. So yeah, I really like it.
Hi, my name is Maria. So my question has something to do with development environments like Notepad++, VS Code, PyCharm. So what is your opinion on teams using like the same or different IDEs? Do you think what's your opinion with that in general?
Right. So in general, in my experience, we were always like free. You can use whatever IDE or code editor that you want. But one thing that happens is that, like, for example, the code linting, that things that happen on your local machine, you have to ask everyone to do that, or they're going to just suffer from the lack of automation if they don't. But there's actually one thing that we tried once, that is the code editor, editor config file, that many popular code editors and IDEs support, that you can share configurations among your team. And you can actually version this file on your repo, so everyone that clones the project will have the same configurations on their IDE.
Sorry, what is it called?
.editor config.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Oh, this one over there.
I think this may be the last question. Just
Hi, I'm Becca. My company is currently switching to more, in terms of the team structure, we're switching from being like the web team, the iOS team, the mobile team, to more of cross-functional product-focused teams, the squad model like Spotify does. And our team, I'm on web, is a bit concerned about that because they're talking about like hiring web developers to just be on the product team. And we're concerned that that's going to like decrease the sense of ownership of maintaining quality code base. Do you have any suggestions of, like, all of these sound like great ideas, but do you think any of them in particular are going to become very important to make sure we can maintain the standards of people outside of the team contributing to the code base?
Right. Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question, because like you reached the discussion topic of like how much autonomy each team should have to have their own style and run their own thing independently of other teams. And to be honest, I think they should be pretty autonomous. And like it's as when you start growing and you start having like millions of teams, you're never gonna keep consistency across all the teams in the company. What you can do is like you can decrease the amount of inconsistency by your interview process, where you hire people with the same mindset, and sharing the knowledge among all engineers in the company, having things like talk nights where people share how they're doing things, and you organically like distribute the same kind of knowledge among teams. But it's hard. You can never go into like micromanagement of each team and like defining that everyone should follow the same thing. That's my opinion on that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tutti. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you. And
All
do you
right,
come up
yeah.
for chocolate?